"Sir, this auction is reserved for serious buyers." The words landed with practiced confidence, loud enough for every collector in the room to hear and just soft enough to invite quiet laughter from the front rows. The polished ballroom inside Sterling Reserve Motors shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, where multi-million-dollar collector cars rested on illuminated platforms like priceless works of art. Every seat was occupied by investors, celebrities, and longtime automobile enthusiasts who had traveled from across the country for the year's most exclusive luxury car auction. Conversations faded almost instantly as dozens of eyes shifted toward the man standing calmly near the registration aisle. Marcus Ellington, 42 years old, wore a perfectly tailored navy suit with a white dress shirt and dark tie. There was nothing flashy about him. No oversized watch. No visible designer logo. No entourage announcing his arrival. He carried only a leather auction catalog tucked beneath one arm and a quiet expression that revealed almost nothing. Richard Collins, the auction director, stepped forward with the polished smile of someone who believed he controlled every moment inside the room. "I'm just trying to save everyone a little time," Richard continued with a courteous tone that somehow sounded colder than an outright insult. "Some of these vehicles will easily sell for over $5 million. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. Someone near the second row chuckled under his breath. Another bidder adjusted his cufflinks without taking his eyes off Marcus, as though waiting for him to apologize for being there. Marcus simply nodded once. "Thank you for letting me know," he replied. His voice was calm, measured, impossible to provoke. Richard blinked, almost disappointed that the response offered no opportunity for a louder confrontation. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to Marcus Ellington. The room slowly returned to its conversations, but the atmosphere had changed. The excitement surrounding the rare automobiles had quietly shifted toward curiosity about the man who refused to react. Marcus walked past rows of immaculate collector cars, stopping briefly beside a silver 1963 Grand Touring Coupe displayed beneath soft white lighting. He studied every detail without touching the vehicle, reading the history card with genuine interest rather than admiration alone. His eyes moved across production numbers, restoration notes, racing heritage, and engine specifications with the confidence of someone who understood far more than appearances suggested. Nearby, a young auction assistant named Emily Parker noticed something unusual. Most guests posed for photographs beside the cars. Marcus never did. Instead, he quietly compared specifications in his catalog, occasionally making brief handwritten notes. Emily had worked enough events to recognize the difference between someone chasing attention and someone evaluating value. Richard watched from across the room. Every few moments his gaze drifted back toward Marcus, as though his presence interrupted the image of exclusivity he worked so carefully to maintain. As the opening announcement echoed through hidden speakers and bidders settled into their numbered seats, Marcus calmly took his place without hesitation. Richard noticed the paddle resting on the chair in front of him, paused for a second, then smiled again. It was the kind of smile that believed the room had already decided who belonged, and who didn't. Neither man realized that before the final hammer fell later that afternoon, every assumption inside Sterling Reserve Motors would be tested in complete silence. The opening presentation began precisely at 1 o'clock as the master of ceremonies welcomed guests from New York, Dallas, Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles, reminding everyone that every automobile crossing the stage that afternoon represented decades of engineering history and private ownership. Soft orchestral music filled the ballroom while attendants rolled the first collector vehicle beneath brilliant lights. Marcus Ellington remained completely still, studying every movement with the patience of someone who had spent years making decisions that could not be rushed. Around him, experienced collectors lifted their bidding paddles confidently, greeting one another with familiar smiles. Marcus did not attempt to join their conversations. He quietly opened the leather catalog resting on his lap and compared handwritten notes with the specifications displayed on the large screen above the auction floor. Emily Parker noticed it again. Every time another guest admired polished chrome or handcrafted leather, Marcus focused on maintenance history, production records, ownership documentation, and restoration quality. His attention was never captured by appearances alone. She leaned slightly toward another assistant and whispered, "He reads these reports like he already knows what questions the appraisers forgot to ask." The other assistant shrugged before returning to work. Richard Collins, however, continued watching from the edge of the stage. His smile never disappeared, but neither did his curiosity. Each time Marcus turned another page or made another small note with his fountain pen, Richard's eyes narrowed just enough to reveal growing discomfort. The first collector car sold within minutes for $1,800,000. Applause echoed through the ballroom as the winning bidder accepted congratulations from neighboring tables. Marcus simply applauded with everyone else before lowering his hands back onto the catalog. He never looked disappointed. He never looked impressed. He looked like someone waiting for something very specific. The second automobile rolled onto the stage, followed by another wave of energetic bidding. Marcus remained silent once again. Several guests nearby exchanged amused glances. One gentleman wearing an expensive gray suit quietly remarked, "Maybe he came for the free coffee." A woman beside him smiled politely without answering. Marcus heard the comment. His expression never changed. Emily heard it too, and for reasons she could not explain, she found herself hoping Marcus would eventually prove every quiet assumption in the room completely wrong. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the auction staff wheeled out the silver Grand Touring coupe Marcus had studied earlier. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Cameras appeared. Conversation stopped. Collectors straightened in their seats. Even seasoned investors leaned forward with renewed interest. The auctioneer described the vehicle's remarkable history, emphasizing its limited production, documented ownership, and award-winning restoration. Marcus slowly closed his catalog. For the first time that afternoon, he reached for the numbered bidding paddle resting on the chair beside him. Emily noticed the movement instantly. So did Richard. Their eyes met across the ballroom for only a second before Richard quietly walked toward the registration table and whispered something to a member of his staff. The employee glanced at Marcus, looked down at a computer screen, then hesitated. Everything on the registration appeared complete. Every required document had been verified hours earlier. Richard frowned slightly before returning his attention to the stage. As the opening bid was announced, Marcus calmly lifted his paddle only a few inches into the air, and although the gesture lasted less than a second, it somehow drew more attention than the auctioneer's voice itself. The auctioneer acknowledged Marcus's opening bid with professional courtesy, but before the next number could leave his mouth, Richard Collins lifted one hand from the side of the stage. "One moment," he said with a polished smile that barely concealed its purpose. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Richard walked toward the front row with slow, deliberate steps until he stood only a few feet from Marcus. "As part of our commitment to maintaining the integrity of this event," he announced, looking around the ballroom instead of directly at Marcus, "we occasionally confirm bidder credentials on exceptionally valuable automobiles." Several guests nodded as though the interruption sounded perfectly reasonable. Marcus looked up calmly. "Of course," he replied. Richard extended his hand. "May I see your bidder registration once more?" Marcus handed him the card without hesitation. Richard examined it for several seconds before passing it to another employee. "Please verify this," he instructed quietly. The employee hurried toward the registration desk while conversations resumed in cautious whispers. Emily Parker watched the exchange with growing concern. She had processed Marcus's paperwork herself earlier that morning. Every document had matched. Every financial requirement had been approved before he received his bidding paddle. She quietly approached the registration computer and searched his file again. Nothing had changed. Every verification remained complete. She glanced toward Richard, wondering why another review had suddenly become necessary. Meanwhile, the bidding continued around Marcus without him. Two collectors exchanged offers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in rapid succession. Each bid was accepted immediately. No questions. No interruptions. No additional verification. Marcus simply watched the numbers rise across the large display above the stage. His expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as though he were studying more than the automobile itself. A gentleman seated nearby leaned toward another bidder and quietly said, "Interesting how patient he is." The other man smiled faintly. Maybe he knows he will never need that paddle again. They laughed softly before turning back toward the stage. Marcus heard every word. He continued saying nothing. A few moments later the employee returned and handed Marcus's registration card back to Richard. "Everything is confirmed," she whispered. Richard accepted the answer with an almost invisible pause before forcing another practiced smile. "Excellent," he said loudly enough for the audience to hear. "We simply wanted to ensure everything was accurate." Marcus accepted the card and replied, "Accuracy is always worth the effort." The sentence was simple, but Emily noticed Richard's expression tighten for only an instant. The auction resumed. This time Marcus lifted his paddle again. The auctioneer accepted the bid immediately. Another collector answered. Marcus responded without hesitation. The rhythm continued steadily, each offer increasing by $50,000. The ballroom became noticeably quieter as more guests stopped focusing on the automobile and started watching the man who had been questioned only minutes earlier. Richard remained standing beside the stage instead of returning to his usual position. His eyes rarely left Marcus. Emily could not shake the feeling that this was no longer about protecting the auction. It had quietly become something else entirely. Every time Marcus entered another bid, Richard seemed to search his face for uncertainty, yet found only calm confidence. The numbers climbed higher and higher until the room realized that the quiet man everyone had underestimated was still competing, and he showed no sign of slowing down. The bidding continued with remarkable precision as the auctioneer's voice echoed across the ballroom, each new offer climbing another $50,000 higher than the last. One by one, several collectors lowered their paddles and leaned back into their seats, quietly accepting that the silver Grand Touring Coupe had entered a different financial league. Only 3 bidders remained. Marcus Ellington, an investor from California, and a longtime collector seated near the front of the stage. The atmosphere no longer felt relaxed. It had become carefully measured, every raised paddle followed by complete silence before the next number arrived. Emily Parker stood beside the registration desk pretending to organize paperwork, but her attention never drifted far from Marcus. She noticed something everyone else seemed to miss. Marcus never looked toward the other bidders after making an offer. He never tried to intimidate anyone. He never celebrated when another paddle lowered. His eyes remained fixed on the automobile itself, almost as though he had already decided what it was worth long before entering the ballroom. Around him, however, the whispers grew louder. "There is no way he plans to finish this," one guest quietly remarked. Another answered, "He probably wants attention before someone stops him." A third guest shook his head. Richard should have checked everything twice. Emily felt increasingly uncomfortable listening to conversations that sounded less like concern about procedure and more like assumptions about the man sitting quietly in the center of the room. She opened the registration database once again, reviewing Marcus's file line by line. Government identification confirmed. Financial qualification confirmed. Deposit received. Bidder authorization active. Every requirement displayed green across her monitor. There was not a single warning or missing document anywhere in his record. She quietly printed the verification summary and walked toward Richard Collins. "Everything is complete," she whispered. "There are no issues with Mr. Ellington's registration." Richard barely glanced at the document before folding it closed. "Thank you," he answered politely. "Leave this with me." Emily hesitated. "Sir, every verification has already been completed." Richard smiled without looking at her. "I appreciate your diligence." His tone remained professional, but the conversation was clearly over. Emily slowly stepped away, carrying more questions than answers. Back on the auction floor, the California investor finally lowered his paddle after another increase pushed the price beyond $4 million. Applause briefly filled the ballroom before fading once more. Only Marcus and the remaining collector continued bidding. Every offer came without hesitation. Every response arrived within seconds. Richard remained standing near the stage instead of returning to his office, his attention fixed almost entirely on Marcus rather than the auction itself. Emily realized something unsettling. Richard no longer seemed interested in whether the automobile would sell. He appeared determined to discover the moment Marcus could no longer continue. Yet that moment never arrived. Marcus calmly raised his paddle again. The auctioneer accepted the bid immediately. The other collector paused longer than before, studying Marcus with narrowed eyes before answering with another increase. Marcus responded just as calmly. The room fell completely silent. Even those who had doubted him minutes earlier stopped whispering altogether. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty was no longer surrounding Marcus. It had quietly begun surrounding everyone who believed they already knew exactly who belonged in that room. The auctioneer announced the next increase with growing excitement as the bidding crossed another historic milestone, drawing murmurs from seasoned collectors who had attended prestigious auctions for decades. The silver Grand Touring Coupe had officially entered record territory, and every person in the ballroom understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The remaining collector tightened his jaw before lifting his paddle once more. The audience applauded politely, recognizing both determination and experience. Marcus Ellington responded only after a brief glance toward the automobile. His paddle rose with quiet certainty, never hurried, never dramatic. The auctioneer accepted the offer, and another wave of silence settled over the room. Richard Collins folded his arms while standing near the stage, his confident smile becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He had expected hesitation. Instead, Marcus continued bidding with the same calm rhythm he had shown from the beginning. Richard stepped closer to the auctioneer during a brief pause and whispered something that caused the older man to glance toward Marcus with visible surprise before nodding reluctantly. Emily Parker noticed the exchange immediately. She felt an uneasy weight settle in her stomach because every unusual interruption that afternoon had involved only one bidder. Across the ballroom, several guests continued exchanging theories. One man quietly insisted that Marcus must be representing another buyer. Another claimed no individual without obvious signs of wealth would willingly compete at this level. Their assumptions floated through the room with remarkable confidence despite having no evidence behind them. Marcus remained completely unaware of the conversations, or perhaps he simply refused to let them matter. As another bid echoed through the ballroom, he rested one hand lightly on the auction catalog. For the first time all afternoon, an old memory crossed his mind. More than 20 years earlier, he had walked into a modest conference room carrying a business proposal that he believed could transform an entire industry. Before he had spoken a single sentence, one executive had smiled politely and asked whether he was there to deliver refreshments for the meeting. Marcus had quietly thanked the man, taken his seat, and delivered the presentation anyway. Months later, the same proposal had become the foundation of a company worth billions of dollars. He had learned something important that day. People often formed conclusions long before they gathered facts, and correcting every assumption was never as powerful as allowing the truth to arrive on its own. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. The auctioneer announced another increase. The remaining collector hesitated for nearly 10 seconds before slowly raising his paddle. Applause rippled across the ballroom once again. Marcus looked toward the beautifully restored coupe beneath the lights, then calmly lifted his own paddle without changing expression. The auctioneer accepted the bid immediately. A long silence followed. The other collector looked down at his notes, calculated the numbers carefully, then finally lowered his paddle onto the table with a respectful nod. The ballroom erupted into restrained applause as everyone waited for the auctioneer to confirm the apparent winning bid. Before the gavel could fall, Richard stepped forward once again and raised his hand. "One final verification," he announced. "Before we proceed with the official result, I believe additional financial confirmation would be appropriate." The applause faded instantly. Emily stared at Richard in disbelief. She knew there was no policy requiring another review. Marcus slowly turned toward Richard with the same composed expression he had carried since entering the ballroom, offering neither frustration nor surprise, as though he had expected this moment long before anyone else in the room realized it was coming. No one moved. The ballroom remained suspended in complete silence as Richard Collins held his hand in the air, delaying the final announcement that everyone had been waiting to hear. The auctioneer looked uncertain, glancing between Richard and Marcus as though searching for an answer hidden somewhere beyond the polished stage lights. Every collector understood that the highest bid had already been made, yet no one seemed willing to question why the process had suddenly stopped. Marcus Ellington slowly stood from his chair without the slightest trace of frustration. He adjusted the sleeve of his navy jacket, picked up the auction catalog, and looked directly at Richard. "You would like additional financial confirmation?" he asked in a calm voice. Richard nodded immediately. "For an acquisition of this size, I believe it is appropriate." Marcus answered with a slight smile. "I appreciate consistency." The sentence lingered in the room. Several guests quietly exchanged glances because they remembered that none of the previous multi-million-dollar bidders had been asked for another verification after the auction had already reached its conclusion. Richard attempted to maintain his confident posture. "We simply want to protect the integrity of the event." Marcus inclined his head politely. "I agree. Integrity matters." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not for a stack of financial documents or an impressive display of wealth, but for a simple smartphone. He unlocked the screen, selected a single contact, and placed one brief call. There was no dramatic speech. No raised voice. No explanation to the audience. When the call connected, Marcus spoke only one sentence. "Good afternoon. Would you please join us in the main auction ballroom?" He listened for a moment, smiled faintly, and ended the call. The entire conversation lasted less than 15 seconds. Richard folded his arms. "Will someone be bringing your financial authorization?" he asked. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Someone will be bringing exactly what is needed." The answer only deepened the confusion surrounding the room. A few collectors assumed Marcus had called a private banker. Others guessed an attorney was arriving with additional paperwork. Emily Parker quietly reviewed the digital registration file one final time. Every requirement remained approved. Every verification still displayed complete. She could not understand why any of this was happening. Minutes passed with almost no conversation. Even the hotel staff serving refreshments slowed their movements, sensing that something important was unfolding. Then the large ballroom doors opened. Several men and women wearing tailored business attire entered together with purposeful but unhurried steps. Their arrival immediately caught the attention of employees throughout the room. Emily recognized two of them from internal corporate newsletters distributed only to management staff. One was the company's chief financial officer. Another served on the executive leadership team. They were not scheduled to attend the public auction. Richard noticed them as well. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly before he forced another professional smile. The executives did not stop at the registration desk. They did not approach Richard. Instead, they walked directly toward Marcus with unmistakable familiarity. Conversations across the ballroom disappeared completely. Every eye followed the small group crossing the polished floor while Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing, calm and patient, as though the next few moments were unfolding precisely as he had expected from the very beginning. The executives stopped directly in front of Marcus Ellington before any of them acknowledged another person in the ballroom. The senior woman among them smiled warmly and extended her hand without hesitation. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellington. We came as quickly as we could." Marcus returned the handshake with quiet professionalism. "Thank you for coming." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere more completely than every bid that afternoon combined. Guests who had spent the last hour whispering suddenly found themselves watching in absolute silence. Emily Parker recognized the woman immediately as the chief financial officer of the parent corporation. Standing beside her were the company's general counsel, the vice president of operations, and 2 members of the executive leadership team. None of them looked confused. None of them appeared surprised to see Marcus standing beside the winning automobile. Instead, they greeted him with the confidence reserved for someone they respected deeply. Richard Collins stepped forward with a practiced smile that now seemed noticeably strained. "Welcome," he said politely. "We were simply completing an additional verification before finalizing the sale." The chief financial officer slowly turned toward Richard. "Additional verification," she repeated. Richard nodded. "Given the value of the transaction, I believed it was appropriate." She paused for a moment before answering. "That will not be necessary." Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" The general counsel calmly opened a leather portfolio and removed a single document. As of last Friday, the controlling ownership transfer of Sterling Reserve Motors Holdings was officially completed. All regulatory approvals were finalized before today's event. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Richard stared at the document without speaking. The chief financial officer continued in an even voice that carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "Allow me to introduce the new majority owner of Sterling Reserve Motors Holdings." She turned toward Marcus with genuine respect. "Mr. Marcus Ellington." The words seemed to stop time itself. Every conversation disappeared. Even the auctioneer lowered his gavel without making a sound. Richard remained motionless, his expression frozen between disbelief and realization. Emily felt her heart race as the events of the afternoon suddenly rearranged themselves in her mind. Every unnecessary question. Every repeated verification. Every assumption. They had all been directed toward the very person who now owned the company hosting the auction. Marcus accepted the document from the general counsel, glanced at it briefly, and handed it back. He did not smile with triumph. He did not celebrate. He simply stood with the same calm composure he had displayed from the moment he entered the ballroom. One collector quietly removed his glasses as though trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Another slowly shook his head and whispered, he was never trying to prove he belonged here. He already did. Richard finally found his voice. "Mr. Ellington, I was not aware of the acquisition." Marcus looked at him steadily. That much became clear. There was no anger in his words. No sarcasm. Only quiet honesty. The chief financial officer addressed the audience. "The auction will now continue according to company policy and with the professionalism our clients deserve." Every eye remained fixed on Marcus, not because of the fortune he possessed, but because he had endured every assumption without raising his voice once, allowing the truth to arrive with a dignity that no public argument could ever equal. For several long seconds, no one in the ballroom spoke. The only sound came from the soft hum of the lighting above the auction stage as every guest slowly absorbed what had just been revealed. The same people who had quietly questioned Marcus Ellington's presence now looked at him with entirely different expressions. Some appeared embarrassed. Others simply stared, replaying every moment of the afternoon in their minds. Emily Parker lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Marcus with renewed admiration. She realized that while nearly everyone else had been measuring appearances, Marcus had measured character instead. The auctioneer cleared his throat gently, looked toward the executive leadership team, and received a small approving nod. He raised the gavel once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the final bid has been verified, and the winning bidder for the Silver Grand Touring Coupe is Mr. Marcus Ellington." Warm applause spread across the ballroom. Unlike the polite applause heard throughout the earlier sales, this applause carried genuine respect. Several collectors stood to their feet first, followed by others across the room. It was not simply recognition of a successful purchase. It was recognition of the composure Marcus had demonstrated during every unnecessary delay and every unfair assumption. Richard Collins remained standing near the stage, noticeably quieter than before. The confidence that had shaped every decision earlier that afternoon had disappeared. The chief financial officer turned toward him with a professional expression. Richard, after today's event concludes, the executive team will conduct a formal review of the procedures followed during this auction. Her words were calm and measured. There was no public humiliation, no raised voices, and no accusation beyond what everyone in the ballroom had already witnessed for themselves. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. The response sounded sincere, but it arrived too late to change what had already happened. Emily quietly stepped toward Marcus carrying the official purchase documents. This time her smile was natural rather than cautious. Congratulations, Mr. Ellington, she said. It has been an honor assisting you today. Marcus accepted the folder with genuine appreciation. Thank you, Emily. You treated the process with professionalism from the beginning. She smiled, surprised that he remembered her name despite everything else that had happened throughout the afternoon. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed with an entirely different tone. The same guests who had whispered doubtful comments earlier now spoke openly about Marcus's patience, discipline, and remarkable self-control. One collector quietly admitted to another, the most impressive thing today was not the winning bid. It was that he never tried to embarrass anyone in return. Another nodded thoughtfully. Real confidence never seems rushed. Marcus walked slowly toward the beautifully restored coupe resting beneath the lights. He paused beside the vehicle for a moment, studying the craftsmanship with the same quiet appreciation he had shown hours earlier before the bidding even began. Nothing about his posture suggested victory over another person. Instead, it reflected satisfaction that fairness had finally reached the room. As photographers prepared to capture the official presentation, several members of the executive leadership team stood beside Marcus with unmistakable respect. The image would later become one of the most memorable photographs in the company's history, not because of the extraordinary automobile, but because it quietly represented something far more valuable. In a room where assumptions had spoken first, dignity had delivered the final answer. As the applause gradually settled, Marcus Ellington accepted the keys to the silver Grand Touring Coupe with the same quiet humility that had defined every moment of the afternoon. He thanked the auctioneer, shook hands with the executive team, and spent a few moments speaking with several collectors who now approached him with genuine respect instead of quiet doubt. Emily Parker watched the conversations unfold and realized that nothing about Marcus had changed since he first walked through the ballroom doors. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else saw him. Before leaving the stage, Marcus turned toward the audience after noticing that many guests were still watching him. He smiled politely and spoke in a calm voice that carried naturally through the silent ballroom. Today was never about winning a car, he began. The automobile is beautiful, but it is only an object. What matters far more is how we choose to see the people standing beside us before we know their story. No one interrupted. Every guest remained completely still. Marcus continued, many opportunities are lost because someone decides who belongs before asking a single question. Respect should never depend on appearance, clothing, reputation, or assumptions. It should be the starting point, not the reward. His words were neither emotional nor dramatic. They were thoughtful, measured, and impossible to dismiss. Richard Collins lowered his eyes briefly before stepping forward. Mr. Ellington, he said sincerely, I owe you an apology for the way today's events unfolded. I allowed assumptions to influence my judgment, and that does not reflect the standard this company should represent. Marcus looked at him for a moment before extending his hand. Richard accepted it with quiet gratitude. Learning begins when honesty does, Marcus replied. What matters now is what happens after today. The executive leadership team nodded in agreement. The chief financial officer addressed the staff gathered near the stage. Every customer deserves the same professionalism, the same courtesy, and the same confidence from the moment they arrive. That standard begins immediately. Emily smiled because she knew those words would shape the future of every event held inside the company. As photographers captured one final image beside the collector car, Marcus thanked the employees individually before walking toward the exit. Several guests opened the doors for him without being asked. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the polished silver finish of the Grand Touring Coupe as it was carefully prepared for delivery. Marcus paused for one last look at the ballroom behind him. Hours earlier, he had entered that building carrying nothing more than a catalogue and quiet confidence. He left having reminded an entire room that dignity cannot be measured by appearance, and character never needs to announce itself. As the engine started with its smooth, unmistakable sound, Marcus drove away without celebration or spectacle. The greatest victory of the day had never been the record-breaking bid. It had been the quiet demonstration that true leadership does not demand attention, does not seek revenge, and does not need to raise its voice. It simply raises the standard for everyone willing to learn from it, proving once again that the strongest answer to prejudice is consistent excellence, unwavering dignity, and respect offered freely long before anyone discovers who is truly standing in front of them.